In all of 90s middle school kid video game lore, nothing was as mysterious, dramatic, and scandalous as the legendary Mortal Kombat Blood Code. For the uninitiated, Mortal Kombat was a photorealistic tournament fighter game full of ninjas, lightning-wielding gods, and bizarre four-armed creatures. It was set apart not only for its realistic graphics as opposed to the polygons of games like Virtua Fighter or the shaded cells of Street Fighter II, but also for its visceral, violent content that could be enhanced with a code. We owned the Sega Genesis version, and after the logo screen came up, another screen showed up which gave the backstory to the game, beginning with the words, quote, "The word code has many definitions. The Shaolin martial arts tournament is governed by a system of rules of conduct, an ethical code. The combatants respect each other as warriors, no matter what degree of hatred they have for one another. A code of honor. Another type of code could be defined as an arbitrary system of symbols or letters for transmitting messages, a secret code. Mortal Kombat adheres to many codes, but does it contain one?" End quote. It did in fact contain one, a secret code, a blood code. Rumors began to spread around my church school that when the honor code screen came up, if you pressed ABACABB on your Sega Genesis controller, the game would activate gory elements. First, when you punched and kicked your opponent, blood splatter would fly out of them. Second, an option called Fatality would appear. This meant after beating up an opponent, you could enter another sequence of buttons and you would finish them off in diabolical ways. For example, the ninja Sub-Zero would rip the head off, spine dangling from the severed neck. While the graphics were only 16-bit, it was enough to horrify society. The game became a key piece of evidence in the 1993 Senate hearings on video game violence that eventually led to the ESRB game rating system. Jeff Peters, a designer who helped bring the arcade game to the Super Nintendo consoles, describes the impact of the gory game on his very normal personal life. An article from Polygon reports, quote, "One morning Peters said hello to a neighbor and got a chilly stare in return. Peters went cold. They know, he thought. I was ostracized in the neighborhood I lived in because they found out I worked on Mortal Kombat," he said. Peters didn't realize he'd been cut out of the inner circle right away. Every now and then his doorbell would ring and he'd find one of the neighbor's kids peering in. "Do you guys do drugs?" one blurted. Startled, Peters said no. The kid scampered home. "Do you worship Satan?" another tyke asked. "My mom says you're going to hell. How come she says that?" End quote. Mortal Kombat is only one of many games that comes up in moral panics, court cases, and the angry voices of concerned parents, clergy, and educators. Video games in general have been blamed for a variety of societal horrors. While the influence of video games, not to mention the gamification of just about everything, is undeniable, how that influence functions is a source of intense debate. Part of the discussion around media effects that many, particularly those in conservative faith traditions like Adventism, don't seem to be able to grasp is that the makeup of the player has a large role to play when it comes to how a piece of media affects them. An old idea called the hypodermic needle theory that arose in the 1930s and 40s suggests that all media had to do was inject society with a message and audiences would passively accept it. Statements like, "You are what you watch," or "You are what you read," reflect this idea. If it were true and that simple, anyone who read the Bible or saw a piece of Christian media would become a convert. We know now that things are much more complex. To help unpack this complexity, I've invited a scholar who I have had the privilege of working with. Rachel Kowert is a doctor of psychology and an internationally respected scholar working at the intersection of mental health and video games. She is also the founder of Zeitgeist, a multimedia content production studio for the science of games and pop culture. She has also worked with organizations such as the Department of Homeland Security, exploring the connection between games and extremism. Currently, she is editing a series of Zeitgeist books with Carnegie Mellon University Press, exploring popular culture and psychology. I was privileged to be able to contribute a chapter to her volume Exploring the Witcher, and I am excited to welcome her on this episode, which I'm calling Don't Hate the Player, Hate the Game, Video Game as Monsters. I'm Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Welcome, Dr. Rachel Kowert, to Beast and Bible podcast. So glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have enjoyed reading your work. I've enjoyed working with you on various projects and in discussions. And there's so many things I want to ask you as we get into this topic on video games as sort of a cultural monster. I think particularly from what I've seen, for people of faith looking for explanations for terrible things happening to their youth and in society. But I wanted to kind of open up with a softball question. What was your first video game hangover? And what I mean by that is you played through this game, and when it was over, you were genuinely depressed and sad when it was over. Like you had to leave that world, and it just, you didn't feel like playing another game, reading a book, watching a movie. Like, oh, it's over. What was that experience for you?
Final Fantasy VI.
Oh, okay, yes.
My first love. I mean, Chrono Trigger, definitely I loved, and not Plants vs. Zombies, all the LucasArts games I loved, but Final Fantasy VI was really the one where I was like, nothing will ever be this good, ever.
Yes, and that's the one for, if I'm remembering right, so I grew up, in the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo wars, that's Final Fantasy III in the US. Is
yes,
that right?
That's correct.
So yeah, I feel that, definitely feel that one. The storytelling, the world that was created, yeah. Even some of the music, even though it was like 16-bit, which has been later orchestrated, which is amazing. One of the ways I troll my wife sometimes, who is not a gamer, is I'll put on this orchestrated version of whether it's Final Fantasy or some other game. Oh, this is beautiful. What is this? I'm like, it's a video game. And it's like, no, I can't like this.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I think in our dialogue too, I shared mine was the Sega CD version of Lunar Silver Star. That just wrecked me when it was over. Like it was the first time we had, at least for me as a non-PC gamer, we had cutscenes, we had animations, which really pulled you into the game and made it, this is video. I'm in a more immersive world, and the storytelling again in this massive world, the CD-ROM compared to what we had with cartridges was, when that ended, there is still a part of me, by the way, there's a website called lunar-net.com, I believe, and it's still holding out for a third sequel, and it's it's like 30 years later and it's not going to happen, and people just cling to this hope. I guess it was started at one point and abandoned, and it's good to know that people are still grieving, that we're not going to get that third game. They keep doing spinoffs for like the handheld systems, and it's not satisfying. So if Game Arts is listening, which they're not, but if they were, you guys, like, come on, we're all waiting for this. All like 200 of us who played the game are waiting for this. Anyway, so moving on to more serious things. For those unfamiliar with your work, can you share a bit about your education, your research journey, as well as your nonprofit organization, Zeitgeist?
Sure. I have a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in counseling, and a PhD in psychology. I wanted to be a therapist and quickly determined that emotional labor life was not for me. I did the master's and I did all the training to be a therapist, and it was a really wonderful experience, but I knew that just, you have to have the right personality, just like you have to be the right demeanor to be a pastor. I think you have the right demeanor to be a therapist. And so during that training, it was peak World of Warcraft era. It was like 2014, 2015. Yeah. And so a lot of parents that I was seeing as clients had concerns about games. And that is when I pivoted to a research-based PhD. I'd played games my whole life, and I wanted to find answers to their questions about, are games doing something harmful? Should I be worried socially, psychologically about my children? So I did that. And then Zeitgeist actually was a COVID hobby. So we all needed hobbies when we were all at home. And Zeitgeist started as a YouTube channel to kind of disseminate all of the scientific knowledge I have in around games. Do games make you aggressive? Do games make you antisocial? This sort of thing. 7 to 12 minute videos. And it has since expanded also to a podcast and also to a book series, which you contributed to, the Zeitgeist of Pop Culture, where we talk about the psychology of our favorite fandoms.
And thank you for that invitation, by the way. That was a great project. It's proudly on my shelf. We worked on the Witcher fandom and franchise, looking at different themes and things in that. Very, very popular. Although now with the switching out of Henry Cavill in the series, there's a lot of angst and there's a lot of feelings. We're not going to get into that because that would derail this whole interview. We'd be doing something else.
It makes me sad.
Let's not get sad. I have never in any franchise that I have watched, when they switch out the actors for a main character, even a supporting character, it's really hard to get back into it. No, good stuff. And I had friends of mine who kind of in that era who legitimately, we'll maybe talk about this later, but who got into World of Warcraft, and they had family members that literally they had to do an intervention on because they were playing, 10, 11, 12 hours a day. And this is a while ago. And so please correct my fuzzy memory if this is wrong, but I think there was at least one news story that came out where somebody died, not because the game, itself per se, but they played so much. It was like 22 hours a day. It was some extreme kind of addiction. And so that kind of lent fuel to this narrative that, video games are super dangerous. And maybe that is a segue into this next question, where video games are often seen as the cause of violence and tragedy in the wake of terrible events such as like school shootings. Is it fair to blame games for violence and antisocial behavior?
No. Probably want a longer answer.
Yeah, I was gonna say, great. Next, move on.
No, we are, as humans, my Psych 101 teacher would always say this phrase: humans are cognitive misers. We're lazy thinkers, and we just want the easiest solution to a problem, even if the problem is complex. So in the case of violent acts of violence, like a school shooting, if you take into account video games and the statistical model when we're looking at cause and effect, but if you also take into account demographic factors, age, previous exposure to violence, socioeconomic status, access to weapons, low frustration tolerance, all of these things, the effect of media disappears, because media is not going to change our behavior. We are not going to be a fully well-adjusted individual and then play a game that's considered violent and then commit atrocities. There's no evidence to suggest that. And we have thousands of studies that support that contention. It's just a real easy scapegoat, because talking about all those other things is complex and nuanced and takes a lot of effort, and we're lazy thinkers.
Yes. Yeah. And this brings up, there's so many things I want to talk about. Reading one of your books, you kind of open with an assessment of the types of studies that are done when it comes to violence and frustration and aggressive behavior in video games. And maybe talk about this particular faulty model where basically the control game in the group is like a puzzle game, like where you match like maybe 4 yellow squares in a row, like pretty simple, game. And you're given maybe 30 minutes to play, an hour to play, and then it turns off. And how did you feel about that? And then, of course, the game that's considered violent, whether it's Halo, Mass Effect, Call of Duty, whatever it is, we know this as gamers, are far more complicated in terms of the controls that you have to learn, in terms of the intensity of the situations, the narrative. There's a lot going on. And so getting into a game like that, there's a steep learning curve. I can, a toddler, almost could put, 4 green squares in a row. To learn how to navigate a complex, war simulation, is complicated. And so as someone is trying to figure this out, and then you shut the game off after 30 minutes or 45 minutes, it's really frustrating. Like, this is a hard game. And so then the study, and maybe correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, but then, the researchers like, oh, see, they're angry. Well, of course they're angry. Like, this is a hard game to play, and you just turned it off in the middle of the learning curve. So do I have that kind of right? Is that kind of how what's happening?
There's a lot of studies, and I love that you mentioned that, because it also plays into something that even non-researchers, I think, can relate to. Whereas if you have a child who's playing a game like a first-person shooter and you hear them yelling at the screen, I don't like first-person shooters because I don't have the best hand-eye coordination. But for a while, I played America's Army, which is a first-person shooter. And I broke several mice on my computer, because when I would throw a grenade, it would bounce on the wall and come back and hit me every time. And I would pick up my mouse and I would slam it against the desk. Yeah. From the outside, that looks like aggression, but research actually shows, just as you mentioned, it's actually frustration. Yeah. It's frustration with not being fast enough. It's frustration with the learning curve. It's frustration with the social letdown of your team. These games are often social and other people are relying on you. Yep. So it's easy to see how it looks like anger, but scientifically, when you assess it, it is frustration. Yeah.
And this brings up memories of mine. As we talked a little bit before, I just contracted with Bloomsbury to contribute to a pop culture series. I'm going to be writing a book on Castlevania, looking at theology and religion in the Castlevania video games and franchises. And as I'm currently writing the introduction to the book, I'm remembering my first exposure to this game. And it was on the Nintendo Entertainment System, 8-bit. And, I have nostalgic memories of that system, but in terms of sophistication and controls, it was pretty primitive and frustrating. So there are moments in the game where, I'm pressing the button. I know I'm pressing the buttons. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. And this flying Medusa head comes out of nowhere and hits me in a way like I jumped. I mean, I remember, my siblings and I yelling, I pushed the A button, I pushed the button, and it didn't do it. So it's not that the violence of being a monster hunter, killing these horrible beasts in the game is making me violent. It's the game itself is not sophisticated enough or intuitive enough where I'm frustrated. I did what I was supposed to do. And I think, maybe an equivalent if you're playing a board game and there's a mechanism in the board game, mousetrap comes to mind, the old sort of, what's the term I'm looking for, where you make the contraption, a Rube Goldberg kind of a machine. And you go through this process and the very last thing of the trap just gets stuck. And so you wait the whole game, for this thing to work, and it's so cheap, and then it doesn't, and you're so angry. And it's not the game itself didn't make you violent; it's the broken, mechanism. So yeah, I think it's really easy to label gamers as, you're antisocial, you're violent. Like, no, the game is actually just not very good. And I'm not very good. I'm still learning, how to play.
I think the other thing worth mentioning too is that we've done hundreds or thousands probably at this point of studies looking at the links between video games and aggression. And only a small handful of studies have actually come out and be like, yes, there is a link and we found it. And some are like the ones you said. And the other ones are ones like you go into a lab and you play 10 minutes of a game you consider violent. And afterwards, you do a word completion task. So you go in, you do a word completion task, you see KI blank, you put kiss, you play 20 minutes of a game, you come out, instead of kiss, you put kill. And they say, oh, you're more aggressive now. And it's like, what kind of validity does that actually have in how we're engaging in the world around us? Very little, I'd imagine.
Yeah. This gets into some other things. And on another episode this season, when we're talking with Joseph Laycock and Eric Harrelson on their work on how horror movies impact religious worldview, I mentioned two theories that come up quite a lot, or there's actually three that come up quite a lot in communication studies and theories of media effects. One is media agenda setting, and the idea, what has been shown over and over again, is media don't tell us what to think, but they do tell us what to think about. They do impact the links we make between things, but they don't necessarily make us do things. Cultivation theory is another one, comes around 50s, 60s, where they're trying to look at the violent, television being the big medium then, of course, and finding this idea that if you were to spend all your time, like the one I used to use in class, like if I had never been to the Cotswolds, which I have been to, and it's beautiful, and I love going to England. But if I'd never been there and my only exposure was all the BBC murder mysteries, it might cultivate a worldview where I think the Cotswolds are more dangerous than it is. So it's not necessarily making me violent, but I might be more fearful going to these beautiful idyllic countrysides thinking there's a murderer and a poisoner around every corner here in these villages. And it's totally not true. Another example I've got is watching early Disney, like Mary Poppins, and so the picture of London that was cultivated was this 19th century whimsical. And I remember going to London for the first time, like, what are these skyscrapers doing here? This is not, where's the chimney sweeps? And that's not that, in some part of your mind, that's not real, but media it doesn't make you do things, but it can, depending on where you're at. You mentioned this psychologically, emotionally. I've read studies where birth order matters. I mean, all kinds of factors. It might move you towards something, but it doesn't necessarily make you do something. There's a lot that has to do with your personal makeup. And then the other one is uses and gratifications theory, which it sounds so simple, but at one point when it came out, it was revolutionary. Everyone was so concerned about how, what are media doing to us? And then the question gets reversed, what are we doing with media? And so when I sit down and I play a game as a researcher, I'm playing it through a very different frame than, a 12-year-old just looking to kill a rainy afternoon, right? And so how, it's not that I'm not affected, but I'm going to be affected differently based on what am I using this for? So circling back to the points you made, how much, media affects people, but how much of that is nuanced based on a lot of personal factors and is it more important to be self-aware versus just pointing at the content of the video game?
Content, I like to call the content the mood music of the experience. Like the content is in many ways the least important part of the experience. Touching on uses and gratifications, I think a great way to think about that is when we talk about quote unquote game addiction. I will caveat that game addiction is not formally recognized by the American Psychiatric Association. World Health Organization has moved forward with a designation, but that's a tenuous connection and it's being argued by scholars at the moment. But when we talk about someone who's using games in a way in which it is causing problems in their life, we look through the lens of uses and gratification. Are you using games for a distraction on a rainy afternoon? Are you playing 6 hours of Minecraft today because it's raining outside? That's totally different than, are you playing 6 hours of Minecraft to avoid your responsibilities that you're failing
Yeah.
to achieve. So definitely we look at it through those lens. And I think the personal aspects that you're bringing to it absolutely affect the way that it then reciprocally.
Yeah. One thing I've heard thrown out as sort of tangentially related to both video game and media effects is, well, look at advertising and how much money people spend, millions of dollars like to advertise in the Super Bowl. They wouldn't do it if it didn't work. And I remember teaching media effects and advertising and basically saying, well, it does affect people, but I think any advertiser, as confident as they are in the theories and tactics that they use, and they certainly work, but they will also admit it's a gamble, right? So
Yes.
it's you don't have what's typically known as the hypodermic needle or the magic bullet theory, which comes out in the early 20th century, post World War I and II. The idea that I can be so sophisticated that I can send out a message and it's going to hit everybody the same way. We know this even from the church world, right? We advertise for an event. In my tradition, we do a lot of what are called evangelistic series, and we do a lot of looking at some of the images in books like Daniel and Revelation, which are scary. They relate, to the end of time kind of stuff, and in moments in society like now that feel destabilized. How can we make sense of these things? How can we find hope, et cetera? But we'll send out 20, 30,000 of these like dynamic looking flyers, and you get about a 1 or 2% return. Mm-hmm. And so as far as attendance, and so the idea that, they spend millions of dollars because advertising works, but you have to spend so much money and cast such a wide net to get a little bit, and there's so many studies to show, people remember the advertisement, it was funny, but it didn't make them buy Oreo cookies, it
right.
Yeah. So it's sort of almost a red herring to say, oh yeah, they spend money on advertising because it works. Like, well, yeah, but it's also like if you sit at the roulette table and you kind of know what you're doing, you might win sometimes. It's a little bit more complicated.
Agree. Like, I think word of mouth is actually the best way for turnover, right? I've never seen a Super Bowl ad and been like, I need that product I've never heard of.
Yeah. The only things that have ever worked on me, and I know what they're doing, that's what makes it even more aggravating, is if I'm on Instagram and I see there's a coffee or there's a particular food or restaurant, I'm like, I didn't need to see that. So now I need to go to this restaurant and buy that. I'm hungry. That will work sometimes, but not all the time. Because sometimes you're like, I'm broke. I can't afford to go buy that. So far more complicated. And so moving to this question, maybe I'm gonna flip flop a couple questions from the ones that I had sent you before. I want to circle back to addiction. An area that games do get targeted for is addiction, and as you mentioned, it is not formally recognized yet. As a thing. Not that games can't play a role in how people are using them for antisocial or dysfunctional sort of behavior. Mm-hmm. But can you talk about some of the tensions regarding gaming and addiction?
Yes. Again, we're going to go back to being a cognitive miser. People want a simple solution to a complex problem. So people can absolutely play games problematically. They are avoiding responsibility. They're failing to, meet their occupational goals, going to school, being social, canceling other things they normally do, et cetera, et cetera. And that can be challenging. But the instinct is to say, it must be the game. It must be the game that's causing this problem because there's nothing wrong with the person who's playing it. It's the game that's the problem. Yeah. And then the instinct is to take the game away. Yeah. But what we find in the research actually is that the game is serving a purpose, uses and gratifications. It is a tool that is serving as a coping strategy for something, and it's usually underlying depression or anxiety tends to be found in the research. But why that's really critically important is because when you go to seek mental health support and resources, you will be seeking resources for the depression and the anxiety, not the game addiction. Yeah. There's several for-profit game addiction clinics that have popped up. It's kind of unclear what they're doing in these spaces because, again, the research base, addiction traditionally is a chronic condition like alcoholism. It's chronic. You have it your whole life. And we see periods of quote unquote game addiction be episodic, and it's not showing that it's chronic at all. We're seeing people who meet the diagnosis at time 1, 6 months later, no one has the diagnosis. Like there's a lot of things to consider that indicate that the games are just kind of a side effect of something.
Yeah, no, that's really good. There's a couple ideas that come to mind. And again, this is something I've talked about in another episode this season on the podcast. In advertising and in media, there's the heuristics of availability, right? And so all of us, as you said, we're lazy thinkers. I even had a preaching professor who said people will go out of their way not to think. And so advertisers look at like, what are sort of the archetypes? What are the mental shortcuts that we can play on with certain images? to move, this gets into, and I don't want to necessarily deviate here because there's a couple episodes this season we talk about like moral panic and folk devils, right? We all have these unverbalized fears and scapegoats, and and if we can find anything that, is remotely uncomfortable, or it'll trigger, I know it's that video game, it's this other group of people, it's this, I'm thinking back to the several episodes with Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, several very tragic cases that involved suicide, that involved mental illness, that involved, a lot of things. And as opposed to treating maybe the mental illness, maybe the dysfunctional family dynamics, it's that board game. The board game did it, and it makes it to the level of traveling, quote unquote, experts, which they weren't. Law enforcement gets involved. It just becomes this, easy way to avoid dealing with more complex problems that don't necessarily have an easy solution.
Yeah, moral panic is real. And I know you've talked about it before, but, games are just the latest in the long line of it.
Yep.
Right. We saw it with Dungeons and Dragons. We saw it with television. We saw it with crossword puzzles. We saw it with the printing of the Bible in the common language. Like we saw it with lots of things. Yeah.
It's so funny. I remember doing a book review. There's a book called Jesus and the Internet, which has been out for over 10 years now, I think. But looking at when the Gutenberg press arrived and they're printing Bibles, people are getting them in their vernacular, which from a Protestant perspective is great. Yeah, let people read it. But they're noticing that people are getting different interpretations. So they tried to print these, what we would call hermeneutics, these interpretation guides to make sure people all had the same reading. And it obviously didn't work, So
of course not.
Of course not. So it's so complicated. Yeah. And maybe we've already talked about it, but kind of in summary, what makes gaming, especially video games, such a ready monster for society wanting an explanation for awful realities? And I know you're in Canada, I believe, right? Yeah. And so I'm coming from a US perspective, but there's a lot of history and dialogue about the history of media and popular culture and quote unquote high culture, and why is it that popular culture, particularly video games, is such a monster for people to go after?
Because the young people like it, Seth. That's one reason.
Yeah.
Well, moral panics are about fear of new technology. So games are just the kind of newest technology. And I think what made people particularly concerned, like say moving from comic books or Dungeons and Dragons, is the interactivity of the game.
Yeah.
And I want to validate the perspective that I very much understand the shortcut between they're inputting buttons and moving things on a screen, and the things on the screen are doing things that look bad, like Mortal Kombat when that came out, right? That was huge. It was huge.
Yep.
Senate hearings, and everyone was upset about it. And I can see that connection. But the thing is, now we've been studying it for 50, 60 years, and we just know that connection isn't there. Building upon the moral panics of the past, we know that television has low impact. We know that Dungeons and Dragons is actually a really great activity for people to be creative and social, and doesn't have links inherently to Satan worship or whatever they were saying it was. So I think that it's going to continue to be the focus until like VR, AR becomes more ubiquitous and affordable, because it needs another moral panic to like take over, and they'll be like, oh, it's not those video games. Now it's the metaverse, or it's AI or whatever.
Yeah. So what are some ways, I'm thinking of the parents who are listening, fellow ministers who are listening, gaming scholars who don't just have an academic interest in this, but they're a very practical interest. They're looking out for their kids. And, what I've said because of this podcast looks at pop culture. Obviously, we don't take the stance that everything is bad. And we also don't take the stance, that just consume everything mindlessly. That's fine. So two extremes. So we want people to be thinking, and we want people to have nuanced ways of discussing things. So what are some more nuanced ways, particularly those, I would say probably parents, who are trying to say, my kids, maybe my grandkids are consuming media. What are some nuanced ways of discussing video games and how they affect us?
Think about games as tools. They're tools for social connection. They're tools for creativity. They're tools for play. Play is often the last thing we talk about in the list, even though play is so important throughout the lifespan. So I think if we can move beyond this idea that games are frivolous and have no value, and which that's not true, and towards the idea that they are tools where they are learning and engaging and being creative and learning new skills and that sort of thing, we can start to have a more nuanced take inherently about what games are and what they aren't. If you're concerned about what they're playing and you don't want to play with them, is always what I say. But I also say, just talk to them, like look over their shoulder. It can be so casual. What are you playing? Why do you like it?
Yeah.
And you might be really surprised. Like my son plays Minecraft and he just likes to build like sculptures and statues and he's really amazing at it. And so
Yeah.
when you say, why do you like it? He's like, I can be creative and I'm making these 3D models and it's really fun and cool.
Yeah.
And it gives you new perspective instead of just thinking he's wasting his time
Right.
playing Minecraft.
Yeah. What is it? And maybe this is another element. What is it about play that we equate with wasting time? I mean, that's a bigger question, but I know that comes up. And I'm just thinking of my own, faith background, which kind of emerged in the 19th century, where you've got this Protestant work ethic, kind of an idea where, you got to be productive all the time, which gets into maybe some comments on capitalism. You better be producing all the time, and if you're not producing something, you're wasting your time versus, there is space to just be and play. So why do we have such a hard time with play?
Yeah, as adults, we have a real hard time. We firmly believe it's for children. We very encourage it in children. And then we get to a point where we think play is not important. But, again, research finds play is related to an extended lifespan. It solidifies friendships, all of these things. But there's a great quote from a psychologist. His name is Brian Sutton Smith. And the quote is, the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. What he's getting at is that play is integral to the human experience and having a full, satisfied life. But we think the opposite is work.
Yes.
But it's not. Yeah.
There's a book called A Failure of Nerve by a gentleman named Friedman, and it's talking about leadership and unhealthy triangles and relationships and family systems theory. But one of the points he makes is that, and I'm not a biologist, so I can't speak like absolutely to this, but he basically said play is a mammalian thing. Like animals or mammals play, reptiles don't. And so we're not reptiles.
Interesting.
And so play in terms of development, this is part of not just not even just the human experience, which it is, but even just the mammal experience. This is the animal world plays. You look at otters, you look at puppies, snakes, maybe not so much. A lizard, debatable, but as part of, human experience. And if you don't do that, it ends up creating a lot of social and family dysfunction if you cannot play together and you can't enter into imaginative spaces where you're trying on roles and solving problems.
Yeah, what makes play different? There's a lot of theorists and philosophers who were talking about play back in the olden days when they were first trying to define it. But it's the idea that it's something completely separate. You're doing it just for the sake of enjoying it.
Yeah.
When's the last time we did that, and you think about it releases endorphins and increases creativity skills and you foster new experiences. Like some of the best memories my kids have is me playing Minecraft with them. I don't usually play Minecraft because 3D spatial awareness, again, not a strong suit. And I'll just like fall off a cliff and they think it's hilarious. Like I'm not good at it, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
Because we're just having fun.
Right. It reminds me of one of my favorite memories we got. I think it was Virtua Fighter, which is a pretty, there's no blood, no gore. It's just these pixelated figures. And for birthday, we had a bunch of people who were not gamers, just a variety of people play this game with no previous experience. And one of the most hilarious things where people are like literally crying, laughing is you'd have somebody who's never played a game before and they've managed to get the pro gamer in the corner and just punching him in the face with there's mashing one button and the person can't do anything about it, and everyone's laughing, or you'd have someone inadvertently mash the buttons and unlock some secret move. They had no idea what they were doing. And it was just this funny, moment where even as adults, we were just laughing, at the game and bonding over it, having this memory.
Yeah. Doesn't sound frivolous to me.
Yeah, no, it was really good. It was a good gathering. So, pivoting more formally now to religion in games and kind of pulling this out of, obviously I'm in a Christian context, but you might even be able to say worldview or spirituality, to broaden it for people. So pivoting to religion and video games have increasingly made use of not only spiritual themes, but narratives and iconography. As I mentioned in our previous discussions, Assassin's Creed formally highlights in the beginning of each game, we consulted with a variety of religious groups at the beginning, to produce this narrative. And one of the more extreme examples is in Assassin's Creed 2. The player actually engages in a brawl, like a fist fight with the Pope in the Vatican, which as a Protestant is a weird space to be in when you're playing that game. Like there are people I know who are not fans of Catholic theology, and I thought of them like, what would they do in this really weird scene? Another game we mentioned that is full of it, and one of the reasons I'm writing the book on it, is Castlevania, which is now a popular Netflix animated series. Definitely not for children. Put that caveat in there, which contains numerous explicit discussions of God and evil and justice. And so how do you see video games making use of religious content, and how does this have the potential to shape belief?
These themes are universal. The idea of something bigger than us, the ideas of justice, the idea of good versus evil. I mean, you
Yeah.
talked about it in the Witcher book, even this idea of monsters and men. I think what's really powerful with games is their ability to tell stories that you as the player are actively navigating through. And
Yeah.
in many ways, that is much more powerful
Mm.
than sitting and watching something with a similar theme. A good example is it's not about religion, but it's this idea is Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. It's a big AAA title where the main character displays hallucinations and delusions associated with schizophrenia.
Mm.
And that's not the point of the game. It's not a mental health game. It's just
Right.
they consulted, and that's part of the character.
Yeah.
And they have this video that they host on Steam with testimonials of people who said, this completely changed the way I see and understand these themes because I had to navigate these themes as the protagonist. And
Yeah.
I think the same could be said with these themes of religion. Like I play a lot of Final Fantasy. Those are deeply steeped in religious
Yeah.
beliefs. And it's a really powerful way to tell that story and
Yeah.
change the way we perhaps see and view the world.
Yeah, I finished a book called Gaming and the Divine, which is a monograph, I think, with Routledge. And I apologize to the author because I'm blanking off the top of my head, but I'll put it in the show notes. But looking at games as a site for doing theology, which is slowly becoming something in religious studies people are realizing. And not just because of the iconography, the narratology in the game, but the actual game mechanics and putting the player in a position to make real moral choices. That's a huge debate in terms of game design, whether it's an actual ethical issue, because people will pause the game, look it up on Google, what's the right choice to make to get the, but, looking at ethics in gaming, the scholar also looks at perhaps the Christological function the player has as being put in a saving role in the game. Sandbox game, the player is a creator. Tolkien talks about being sub-creators as part of being made in the image of God. So this idea that me in this game space creating things is a spiritual act. There's a lot going on. And so, moving ahead a little bit in this area, we worked together. I had this chance to contribute a chapter to The Witcher, the Zeitgeist of Pop Culture series. Again, we'll put that link and make sure people can get the book if they want. And within that specific world of The Witcher, the novels, the games, not as much the Netflix series. And this fandom very well. There's religious movements, the cult of Melitele, the cult of eternal fire, which play, at least in the games, play a big role as far as your interaction as the protagonist. And there's starting to appear peer-reviewed papers on The Witcher and religion. And so one of the questions that I'm rolling around is, how do you see the religious content of a fantasy game like this either mirroring, so is it taking cues? I had one paper that said the cult of eternal fire represents evangelicalism. They're really looking at these kind of things. And then you've got these, I don't want to say weird because that's going to sound pejorative in this sense, but there are people identifying with Jediism. And granted, that comes from, the Jedi comes from the Star Wars movies, but it also the books and scores of video games. And there's some cases where it's simply kind of a snarky option people wrote in. I know they did a religious survey in Czech Republic a few years ago, and very small percentage of people, but large enough to make the religions of Czech Republic, Jedi was in there, which is interesting. But then even within my own Christian tradition, you have the spirituality of Star Wars, and people really taking this seriously. So long-winded question here, but what mechanisms in the game, or games might lead people to follow in-game religious movements in their outside of game lives? In other words, they're really looking at the spirituality of games, and it doesn't stay in the game space. They actually take the imagery, some of the philosophy, and start applying that. So what does that look like for you as a gaming scholar, psychologist? What is happening here?
Yeah. What is happening here?
Yeah.
I think people are inspired by these broad themes of kind of divinity and creation, or good versus evil. Like I don't think they're practicing the Jedi religion in any way. Like how would they even practice that? But I think what they're talking about is more the themes and the values that are espoused in the idea of being a Jedi, which certainly are similar to the themes and the values espoused in traditional religions.
Yeah.
Actually, you're making me think of the game Black and White. Did you ever play that game?
No, I've heard of it.
You play as God.
Yes.
You are a God, and you're either a good one or a bad one. And I don't know. I think that's totally aside. That was from the previous question. I was just thinking about Black and White. I played that game. It's great.
Yeah. No, but I think that's valid too, because we can pivot back a little bit. But you're one of the the arguments for fiction and fantasy is it kind of gives us emotional distance to explore
Yes.
difficult issues.
Yeah.
And so for somebody who, I'm thinking of the film, Bruce Almighty, where anyone could, I haven't seen it in a while, but anyone could be God. It's an easy job. And then realizing, no, this is way more complicated, and so entering a space that may at first blush for some people, oh, that's really sacrilegious, saying maybe in some, for some people, but also it might put somebody in a position to really see how hard would this role be to be a divine being, and maybe gain a little more respect for the challenges that come with that role or how we think of that role. Yeah.
And we realize it's not all black and white. Like I think that's probably why it was called Black and White. To be a good, benevolent God, like your little hand is like white and glowy. And when you're bad, it's like an evil claw. But you have to keep the people happy. And the easiest, quickest way to keep your people happy is to sacrifice people. But if you're the good God, you don't want to do that, right? So you realize, I have to cultivate farms and I have to do that. And it's a lot more complicated. And it's exactly as you say, it's an opportunity to explore.
Yeah. And this gets into a whole other issue, of people sort of having a simplistic view of faith and religion where we really, whether it's God or our faith, we put things in boxes. And then because it's comfortable, again, we're lazy thinkers. It's black and white. There's no in between. Give me what we would call in Christian tradition, a proof text, a nice children's story, and don't think about it, versus, entering into a space like theologians have done for thousands, of years. It's like we have some very difficult, complex things to wrestle with, and we can get answers. I'm not going to argue there's not truth and kind of get this character of postmodernist relativism out there, but there are, it's complicated. Yeah, it's challenging.
Complicated.
It's hard.
That's the answers.
Yeah. So, and that's okay to have tension and things. But sorry. Now circling back to The Witcher. Sorry. So, what do you see in terms of? Because this comes up a lot too, I think, in faith communities. Oh, Hollywood or game designers are trying to demean, religious practice. And so that's why they're throwing in, Christian or Islamic or Hindu, whatever they're drawing from. They're throwing that in the game to make it something silly, light, or to disrespect it. And that's kind of a narrative that's out there. How do you see the relationship between game designers who are maybe drawing on even a diverse body of religious traditions to put images in the game?
Especially with Assassin's Creed is a good example. They consulted with experts in the space. They were not taking it as a trite decision to include these ideas or these themes in their spaces, even if it maybe looks like that if you're finding the Pope. Like that one. I don't think that game designers are out there, the majority of them be like, I'm going to do this and it's going to be hilarious and super disrespectful. I think that game designers want to create games that are art, that they're informed and artistic and draw on, a lot of our universal experiences as humans on Earth. And religion is a big component.
Yeah, that's good. So a popular pastime for some Christian ministries, not just in video games, but in general, is to play a game I call, speaking of games, a game I call Connect the Symbols, where they look at video games or a Super Bowl halftime show, but we're talking about video games, and they'll look to find hidden nefarious schemes to lead people astray.
No.
I've mentioned, we've talked about a few things. I don't necessarily want to call anybody out here, but there's YouTube channels, there's blogs where people sort of have the idea that it's, I'll quote one, it's scientifically, psychologically, and medically proven that role-playing games like World of Warcraft are highly addictive, but could these games be more like a religion than a video game with faithful followers and even martyrs? And it sort of sets the stage for, you might guess, is sort of these games are subversively becoming a new religion. And this opens a challenging discussion because, from fan studies and the idea of fandoms, that there is a connection to religious fanaticism. That's sort of one of the tensions where people who look at fan studies and fandom, for those who don't know, meaning like your particular, if you're a Star Wars fan, that would be a fandom that you like. So, but it's uncomfortable for a lot of people because they're like, I'm not a religious zealot or fanatic. I'm not dying for The Legend of Zelda, or I'm not dying for Star Wars. And yet, I've seen Star Wars themed weddings before. I've seen, where these symbols are really merging with traditional religious spaces. So how do we, when critiques like that show up, where there's this narrative of games are seeking to actively usurp religious experience, and How do you respond, to something like that?
I mean, you're giving them a lot more credit than I think. I think it's kind of like when I see, not to equate it, but sometimes you see governmental conspiracies that are so complex. It's like you're giving them way too much credit for
Right.
what you think is happening behind the scenes.
Right.
I just think that people want a scapegoat for something they think is going awry. Maybe they think religion is on the decline, or their church population is lowering, or, they're concerned that their children maybe don't have the same religious beliefs, and they're concerned and they're looking for something to be like, oh, but they do play a lot of World of Warcraft. So
Sure.
like, it must be that. But also, fandoms bring so much joy into this world. And it makes me really sad to kind of demonize this idea of fandom. I am a huge fan of The Witcher, as are you. It's what brought us together. I would not say it's a religion. I would not say it's something I think about even a little bit as much as I think about religious ideas and values. It's just something I really deeply enjoy because it speaks to me in some way.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to that uses and gratifications. Like, what am I getting from it? I love this story of a non-toxic, really manly man who talks about his emotions and is portrayed as being physically disabled, but he's still really strong. And like, I just really love the nuance of that story.
Yeah.
But it's not, overtaking other areas.
And maybe that gets back into some of what we see, and then we'll pivot to talk about gaming and extremism here in a minute. But this idea of, when you look at how many people play, I'm trying to think about, big franchise that's out now, and there's so many of them, my mind blanks.
Fortnite.
Yeah. So, people are, by the millions playing Fortnite, and you'll have a very small percentage do some weird stuff with it. And I'll just leave that vague, whether it's violent, whether it's like they get reconstructive surgery to look like a character, whatever, something super, what we would consider extreme, right? That probably has more to do with what's happening in that person's, life, psychological makeup, emotional makeup, spiritual makeup, than saying Fortnite is making people, go out and do these things. Yeah.
It's 100% an individual and not a fandom, because it could just as easily be any other fandom.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's the way, just to keep things in mind, and pulling it back even, just from an immediate religious context. I remember hearing, this was after the Dark Knight shooting that happened when Batman opened up, and there was a preacher, and again, this is secondhand. But I had someone attend a series of meetings where a well-known speaker said, see, this is why we shouldn't let our people go to movie theaters, and thinking like, well, there was a shooting in church that happened too. So should we stop doing that? So again, it's really easy to look at people who are maybe engaged in fandoms, whether it's games, novels, movies, that's something that doesn't speak to us, we're not in that world, and think, look at those extreme people. But we forget that people could very easily look at our faith traditions, our political affiliations, and find numerous examples of outliers and extremists, and think,
political affiliation is a great example.
Yeah.
Right, because they're very visible outliers.
Yep. Yeah, you can really see. Look at all those Democrats and all those Republicans. In American context, you're like, well, there's more than that person. But again, as lazy thinkers, it's much easier to label an entire group of people and kind of make this monolith than say, well, that's unfortunate that they've got people in their party, like we have in our party and fandoms and everywhere else. Who sort of stereotypes. That people run with, and But let's talk about the extremes. So you've written a bit on gaming and extremism, and my understanding from listening to some podcast interviews you've done, you're working with the Department of National Defense. Can you share a bit about the relationship of games to extremist behavior and some of the current work you're doing in that area?
Certainly. I'm currently working on a cheer project funded by the Department of Homeland Security.
Homeland Security. Yeah, I'll get that
looking
right.
You're close. Looking at the landscape of extremism in games. So extreme beliefs are just, as you said, beliefs that are extreme from the norm. And we know that gaming cultures can have a reputation for being places where there's a lot of maybe hate speech or kind of racist speech in these chat rooms and in these gaming spaces. And so we wanted to landscape, what exactly are people experiencing? What does it look like? And what does the gaming industry know about it? What tools do they have? And how are they thinking about the cultures of games kind of leaning more extreme? So we did a landscape, and what we found is that most people are exposed to various forms of hate speech in game spaces. Tenets of white nationalism or white supremacy, misogyny is most popular, racism, anti-government sentiment, etc. And now the next step is trying to figure out, okay, if this has embedded itself in the culture of games, what can we do to kind of, for a lack of a better phrase, detoxify these cultures?
Yeah.
Because games are just one other space on the internet. All spaces on the internet have awful things.
I was just going to say, it sounds like Facebook or Twitter X. It sounds exactly.
For sure. Yeah. But where the concern lies for me and kind of my colleagues in this space is that we know that friendships in games form quicker and are more long lasting and form faster. We know that there's maybe a younger demographic using games, especially certain kinds of games than other platforms on the internet. And so we are concerned about, one, bad actors actively going into this space to radicalize youth for mobilization of violence or sexual grooming or that kind of stuff. Yeah. And two, young people being inadvertently exposed to really awful extreme content that's not being properly moderated. So we're trying to figure out where that balance is.
That's really good. So for our listeners who want to deep dive into this, and as we're kind of slowly getting wrapped up here, what are some really good resources, and please promote your own, for people who want to gain a better understanding of video games and media?
Video games and media. I have lots of books on video games and media. I have a YouTube channel. It's called Zeitgeist. And the point of the channel was to make this scientific information understandable by anyone with any kind of background, young, old, scientist or not. So I'd say that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah.
If you're really interested in games and extremism work, we just published a book called Gaming and Extremism, and it is free to download. It won some kind of contest, which is great because nice. I love it when science is free. So you can read that, but that is written for scientists. But I also do want to make sure I have this caveat when we talk about games and extremism or games and, being used for nefarious purposes. This is the real fringe. This is the real extreme end of the experience. And as we mentioned earlier, games are overwhelmingly positive experiences. They should not be the target of our stereotyping and moral panic, and they can be really great experiences to share together. And I hope that you reach out and watch some of these videos or read some of these books to get a better understanding of how games are just like one tool in our toolkit and how we can, enjoy our time with each other or have fun or relieve some stress or socially connect.
Yeah. And kind of almost reversing the question a little bit, because I'm thinking of, maybe it's optimistic of me to think that there might be a high schooler listening to this podcast, or there might be, gamers listening. What can gamers do to sort of help those who are unfamiliar with gaming? I was talking to one of my church members who actually brought up Minecraft, and very sincere, just a wonderful gentleman, said, I know my grandkids played this. Is this a safe game? I don't know anything about, didn't grow up with video games. So what can gamers do, particularly younger gamers do, to invite, the old terminology was you had, digital immigrants and digital natives, right? Or people who I grew up with video games. It's normal to me. But there's other generations that have a steep learning curve when it comes to smart technology and gaming. So what can gamers and particularly youth do to invite non-gamers or their older, friends and family into this space, even to understand and have some good dialogue?
I think the idea of talking about why you like what you play is a really great place to start. And I also think there's this misnomer, again, just about like what games are. So I went to this talk, this was several years ago, and I said, who here in this audience is a gamer? And nobody raised their hand. And I said, who here plays Wordle? And like 95% of the room raised their hand.
Yeah.
So it's about understanding that, yes, Wordle is a game, and it is a game my mom plays religiously. I would say religiously every day, never misses it.
Yep.
So if we can just start to reframe, like, isn't that fun? That 10 minutes you spend trying to figure out, that's the kind of fun I have when I'm playing whatever it is I'm playing.
That's really good. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been super informative, super helpful, and I really hope that our listeners will go out and read your content, subscribe to your channels. We'll put all that information in the show notes, and would love to have you back again to continue to talk about games in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
For many, video games are still caricatured as the provenance of a part of antisocial or socially awkward youths who camp out in their parents' basement and who never touch grass. However, video games have really become a part of most people's lives, especially if they own a smartphone, and half the world's population does. Various vested interests weigh in with sponsored studies extolling the benefits of video games, while others link them to violence and aggression. The result is usually a mortal combat between those who personally love games and those who personally hate them. Like most things in life, gaming in general, be it traditional or digital, is complex, just as people are complex with their own physiological makeups. People have studied media effects for a long time, and while media certainly affect people, media don't affect everyone the same way. As Dr. Kowert notes, it's helpful to think of games as tools that can facilitate creativity and play, something far too many people consider frivolous. Of course, tools can be misused, so instead of making blanket statements about video games or movies or novels or whatever media we're engaging with, we need to do the hard work of self-inquiry. Do our media habits contribute to our overall happiness, or do we use them to escape issues we don't want to address? Do we blame video games as a way to skirt personal responsibility or systemic societal issues that lead people to experience depression and anxiety or to lash out violently? Do we engage a game critically, or do we just mindlessly consume it? Just as video game companies test games, those in Christian faith communities are called to test the spirits, 1 John 4:1. That word test carries the idea of scrutinizing something, not judging at a distance based on our predisposition to media folk devils. In other words, it takes time and work to test anything, and often the results aren't as clean and clear as we would like, and when that happens, we need to admit it. Thank you for joining us on Season 2 of Beast and Bible. I hope it has been entertaining, challenging, and inspiring as you play the game of life.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.